The air in the Thompson John Deere dealership hung thick and heavy, a humid mix of new rubber, fresh green paint, and the faint, sharp tang of hydraulic fluid. It was the smell of progress, the smell of money. And in the summer of 1978, money was flowing like a spring flood through the fields of Iowa. Farmers, flush with cash from 2 years of record corn and bean prices, crowded the showroom floor. Their talk was loud and confident, a booming chorus of acres, bushels, and horsepower. At the center of it all, like a king holding court, stood Warren Bishop. He was leaning against the monstrous rear tire of a brand-new 40cc 40, its paint so glossy you could see your reflection in it. Warren was young, barely 30, with a smile as wide and confident as his credit line at the Farmers and Merchants Bank. He was closing the deal on the tractor, and not just the tractor, but the new 24-foot disc that went with it. Mr. Thompson, the owner of the dealership, hovered beside him, his own smile stretched tight with the effort of containing his glee. "She's a beauty, Warren, a real beauty," Thompson said, patting the tractor's fender like it was a prize-winning steer. "That 155 horses at the PTO will pull that disc through gumbo mud without even breathing hard." Warren just chuckled, taking a long drag from his cigarette. "Well, Tom, if I'm going to farm 1,500 acres, I can't be messing around with yesterday's toys." His eyes scanned the room and settled on the man who had just walked in, letting the screen door slam shut behind him. "Speak of the devil," Warren muttered, a smirk playing on his lips. Jedediah Stone stood for a moment just inside the door, letting his eyes adjust to the indoor light. He was a man carved from the land itself, lean and weathered, with hands that looked like they were made of knotted oak. His denim overalls were worn but clean, and his face was a roadmap of 50 hard-won years under the Midwestern sun. He didn't look at the new tractors. His gaze went straight to the parts counter at the back. He gave a short, polite nod to the room. "Afternoon, gentlemen." A few farmers nodded back, but most were too caught up in the orbit of Warren Bishop and his new machine. Warren took a step forward. "Jedediah, don't tell me you're trading in that old 4020 of yours. The museum called. They want their exhibit back." A wave of sycophantic laughter rippled through the group. Jed's face didn't change. He'd been farming the same 320 acres his grandfather had broken with a team of mules. He did it with a 1968 John Deere 4020 he'd bought used a decade ago, and a 1951 Farmel M his father had purchased brand new. Both were paid for. Every nut, every bolt, every drop of oil in them was his. "Just need a part, Warren," Jed said, his voice low and steady. He walked past the gleaming new equipment, past the circle of admiring men, and stood at the parts counter. Young Timmy, the parts boy, was scrambling to look busy, polishing a shelf that was already clean. "Help you, Jed?" Timmy asked, a little nervous. "Got a call this morning. Said my seal kit for the hydraulic pump came in," Jed said, laying a calloused hand on the counter. "Oh yeah, right here." Timmy ducked below the counter and came up with a small, plastic-wrapped package of gaskets and O-rings. "That'll be $17.42. Jed pulled a worn leather wallet from his back pocket, unfolded it, and carefully counted out a 10, a 5, and 3 ones. He laid them on the counter, along with 2 quarters, a dime, a nickel, and 2 pennies. By now, Warren and Mr. Thompson had drifted over, their conversation about financing and interest rates momentarily forgotten. The sight of Jed counting out exact change was too much of a spectacle to ignore. "Still paying with cash, Jed?" Warren drawled, leaning an elbow on the counter. "Don't you know there's a credit revolution going on? You gotta leverage your assets, man. Make your money work for you." Jed pocketed his wallet and picked up the small package. He didn't look at Warren. His eyes were on Mr. Thompson, who was watching the exchange with an amused, patronizing expression. "Mr. Thompson," Jed said quietly, "while I'm here, I just want to check my balance." Thompson blinked. Then he let out a short, barking laugh. "Your balance, Jed? What did you do? Leave a nickel on account last time you were in?" Warren howled with laughter, slapping his knee. "Maybe he's prepaying for his next spark plug, Tom." The dealership owner grinned, playing to the crowd. All right. Let's see what kind of fortune old Jed's got socked away with us." He turned, still chuckling, and pulled a heavy, leather-bound ledger from under the counter. He flipped through the pages, his finger running down a list of names. Stone. Ah, here we are. Jedediah Stone. He squinted at the page. The smile on his face began to flicker, like a fluorescent light about to burn out. It wavered, then collapsed entirely. His mouth fell slightly open. The noisy showroom seemed to fall silent, the air suddenly charged. Warren's laughter died in his throat, replaced by a confused frown. "What is it, Tom?" Warren asked, stepping closer. "Did he forget to pay for a cotter pin back in '62? Thompson didn't answer. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing in his throat. He lifted his head and looked at Jed, but it was a different kind of look. The condescension was gone, replaced by something that looked unnervingly like respect, or maybe fear. Jed met his gaze, his expression unchanging. "Well?" Jed prompted, his voice still quiet, but carrying the weight of a granite boulder in the silent room. Thompson cleared his throat. He looked down at the ledger again, as if to make sure the numbers weren't a mirage. He spoke, his voice barely a whisper. "Your balance, Jed, your credit balance with us, is $116,450. A collective gasp went through the room. $116,000. It was more than the sticker price of the 4640 and the disc combined. It was more than most men in that room cleared in 3 good years. It was a staggering amount of cash to have sitting anywhere, let alone on account at the local implement dealer. Warren Bishop's face went pale, the color draining from it until it was the shade of sour milk. His cigarette fell from his lips and dropped to the clean concrete floor. He just stared, his mouth opening and closing like a fish on a riverbank. Jed simply nodded. "That's about what I figured," he said. He tucked the small parts package into his overall bib. "Appreciate you holding that for me. You can just take the 1742 out of the account." He turned and walked toward the door, his work boots making a soft, steady rhythm on the floor. The other farmers parted for him like he was Moses, and they were the Red Sea. He didn't look at any of them. He just pushed the screen door open and stepped back out into the bright, hot Iowa sunshine, leaving behind a room full of stunned silence and the smell of burnt-out pride. Now, before we get into what happened next, I gotta ask you all, have you ever seen a man shut down a room with just a few quiet words and a checkbook? Let me know in the comments below what you think of Jed's move right there. Was it pure genius, or was he just showing off? The ride home in his '65 Ford F100 was quiet. The truck's straight-six engine hummed its familiar, reliable tune, a sound as comforting to Jed as his own heartbeat. He didn't drive fast. He never did. The truck, like everything he owned, was treated with a patient respect that bordered on reverence. Its blue paint was faded to the color of a summer sky at dusk, with patches of primer showing through on the fenders where Jed had meticulously sanded away spots of rust. He'd rebuilt the carburetor himself last winter, his fingers, surprisingly nimble for their size, carefully seating the new gaskets and adjusting the float. He knew every quirk of the machine, the way you had to pump the gas twice on a cold morning, the specific groan the leaf springs made when he crossed the railroad tracks just south of town. Back at the farm, he pulled the truck into the shade of the big oak tree next to the machine shed. The shed itself was a testament to his philosophy. It wasn't a modern steel pole barn like the one Warren Bishop had just erected. It was an old-style barn, built by his grandfather with timber from their own woodlot. The red paint was peeling, but the roof was sound, patched and retarred by Jed himself just last fall. Inside it was dark and cool, smelling of earth, old grease, and time. His 4020 sat in the center of the floor, the big rear wheels chocked with blocks of wood. It wasn't shiny like Warren's new tractor. Its green paint was scuffed and faded, worn down to the primer on the edges of the fenders from years of climbing on and off. A film of dust and chaff covered its hood. But to Jed, it was beautiful. He'd bought it from a retiring farmer over in the next county, paid the man in cash, and hauled it home. The first thing he did was spend a week in the shed with it, changing every fluid, checking every belt, and tuning the 6-cylinder diesel engine until it purred like a contented cat. Now, the hydraulic pump was weeping. A slow, steady drip of high-guard fluid had been forming a dark spot on the concrete floor for the last month. It wasn't a crisis yet, but Jed didn't wait for crises. He addressed problems when they were whispers, before they became screams. He changed out of his town clothes and into a fresh set of overalls, the ones already stained with the honest marks of his trade. He wheeled his heavy tool chest over to the tractor, the steel casters rumbling on the concrete. He opened the top drawer and selected a 3-4-inch wrench, the cold, heavy steel feeling familiar and right in his hand. The work was slow and methodical. First, he drained the hydraulic fluid, a thick amber stream gurgling into a galvanized steel tub. Then came the tedious process of disconnecting the lines. Each fitting was stiff, sealed by years of pressure and grime. Jed didn't force them. He applied penetrating oil, waited, and then used a steady, patient pressure, his knuckles straining against the wrench until the fitting gave way with a satisfying squeak. He laid out each bolt, and fitting in order on a clean red rag, a habit his father had taught him. A man who can't find his bolts, his father used to say, is a man who's lost before he's begun. To get to the pump, he had to remove the rock shaft housing, a heavy chunk of cast iron that weighed nearly 200 pounds. He rigged up his chain hoist, looping the chains carefully around the housing, taking up the slack until it was bearing the full weight. With the hoist holding it steady, he removed the last of the mounting bolts. He then carefully guided the heavy component away from the tractor's transmission case, lowering it slowly onto a wooden dolly. With the housing out of the way, the hydraulic pump was exposed, nestled deep in the tractor's guts. It was an intricate piece of machinery, and this was where the real surgery began. He spent the next 3 hours hunched over the tractor, his hands covered in grease and fluid, carefully disassembling the pump, cleaning each part in a pan of kerosene, and inspecting it for wear. He replaced the old, brittle O-rings and seals with the new ones from the kit he'd bought at the dealership. His focus was absolute. The world outside the machine shed, the gossip in town, Warren Bishop's new iron, the whispers of his neighbors. It all faded away. Here, in the quiet company of his machine, things made sense. Problems had tangible solutions. A worn seal could be replaced. A clogged line could be cleared. Effort produced results. The story of Jed's bankroll at the dealership spread through the county like a prairie fire in a dry wind. But as he'd expected, the story got twisted in the telling. At the coffee shop in town, the morning gathering of farmers dissected it over lukewarm coffee and day-old donuts. Can you believe it? Old man Stone, sitting on 100 grand, said one farmer, shaking his head. What in the world is he thinking? He ain't thinking, that's the problem, another chimed in, a man who had just taken out a second mortgage to buy a new combine. That money's losing 10% a year just sitting there with this inflation. He could have bought the old Hemlock place twice over 5 years ago for that kind of money. Warren Bishop, holding court as usual, fanned the flames. His initial embarrassment had curdled into a bitter resentment. It's fear, Warren declared, leaning back in his chair. The man's scared of his own shadow, scared to take a risk. You can't build an operation by hiding your money under a mattress. You gotta be in the game. You gotta expand. Land is the only thing they ain't making more of. Heads nodded all around the table. They were all in the game. They were all borrowing, expanding, buying new equipment on payment plans that stretched out for years. They had to believe Warren was right. If he wasn't, then the foundation of their own operations was built on sand. Jed Stone, with his paid-for equipment and his debt-free life, was an uncomfortable mirror. They saw his frugality not as wisdom, but as a judgment on their own ambition. And so, they dismissed him as a fool, an eccentric old relic left over from the Depression. Jed felt the shift. The nods he got in town were a little cooler. The conversations at the grain elevator would quiet down when he approached. He was an outsider in his own community, a man out of step with the times. The pressure was subtle but constant. That fall, a wicked hailstorm swept through the northern part of the county. It missed Warren Bishop's land entirely, but shredded 20 acres of Jed's best corn, turning the chest-high stalks into a tattered green mess. It was a blow, but one he could absorb. The real test came during soybean harvest. His old International harvester, 915 combine, a machine he knew as well as his own hands, suddenly went quiet in the middle of the field. A main bearing on the cylinder had seized. As he sat there in the deafening silence, the smell of hot metal hanging in the air, he could hear the steady roar of Warren Bishop's new John Deere, a 71120, in the next section over. Warren's machine was a green monster, gobbling up 8 rows at a time, its air-conditioned cab a safe cocoon from the dust and heat. Jed spent the next 2 days and nights in a frantic race against the weather. A big rain was forecast. He worked under the harsh glare of a single bulb strung from an extension cord, his body aching, his knuckles scraped raw. He had to tear down half the machine just to get to the failed bearing. He drove the 30 miles to the all-night truck stop that had a parts supplier for independent truckers, praying they had the right size bearing. They did. He drove back, his eyes burning with fatigue, and spent the rest of the night carefully pressing the new bearing into place and reassembling the massive, heavy components. He finally finished, as the first rays of dawn were painting the eastern sky. He climbed into the cab, smelling of sweat and grease, and turned the key. The diesel engine coughed to life. It was the sweetest sound he had ever heard. He got his beans out of the field just as the first drops of rain began to fall. Warren had finished his harvest 2 days earlier. The decade turned. The 1970s bled into the 1980s, and the boom just kept booming. The grain embargo against the Soviet Union created a temporary dip, but prices rebounded with a vengeance. Farmland in their county, which had been selling for $700 an acre in 1973, was now commanding prices of $2,000, even $3,000 an acre. It was a gold rush, and everyone was convinced the motherlode was infinite. The banks were handing out money with a smile, using the inflated land values as collateral for even bigger loans. The mantra repeated in every coffee shop and feed store was, "Get big or get out." Warren Bishop was getting big. He was the living embodiment of the era's optimism. He bought the Hemlock place. Then he bought another 160 acres that bordered his property to the south. He built a new house for his family, a sprawling ranch-style home with a 2-car garage and a paved driveway, a stark contrast to Jed's simple 100-year-old farmhouse. He traded in the 4640, barely 3 years old, for a massive 8640 articulated 4-wheel drive, a true beast of a machine that could pull a 30-foot cultivator. He was farming nearly 2,000 acres now, all of it leveraged to the hilt. He was celebrated, held up as an example of modern, aggressive farming. The county newspaper ran a feature on him, complete with a picture of Warren, his wife, and their 2 smiling children standing in front of their new tractor. The headline read, "Local farmer bets on the future and wins." Jed Stone just kept doing what he'd always done. The high commodity prices were good for him, too. The checks he got from the grain elevator were bigger than any his father or grandfather had ever seen. But his response to the windfall was different. He didn't look for more land to buy. He didn't go to the dealership to gaze at the new models. After a particularly good harvest in 1980, he took his profits and did what he always did. He paid his property taxes a year in advance. He bought all his seed, fertilizer, and chemicals for the next planting season, paying cash and taking the early bird discount. He replaced the aging roof on the main barn, doing the work himself with the help of his teenage son, Matthew. He took his wife, Sarah, out for a nice dinner at the steakhouse in the city. The rest of the money, a substantial sum, was divided. Half went into a conservative set of bonds, and the other half was driven to the John Deere dealership and deposited into his credit account with Mr. Thompson. His neighbors thought he was crazy. "Jed, for God's sake, what are you doing?" His neighbor to the east, a good man named Frank Miller, asked him one day over the fence line. Frank had just bought 80 acres at top dollar. "You could be buying up land left and right. You're missing the boat. This is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity." Jed looked out over his fields of dark, rich soil. His corn was planted in neat, straight rows. It wasn't the most ground, but it was his. Every single clod of it. He looked at Frank, saw the worry behind the man's enthusiastic eyes, saw the crushing weight of the new mortgage he was carrying. "It's not the price of the land that worries me, Frank," Jed said, his voice gentle. "It's the price of the money you have to borrow to buy it." Frank just shook his head and walked away, muttering about old fools. One cold evening in the late fall of 1981, Jed sat in his workshop, sharpening the blades on his disc. The old radio on the shelf was tuned to the station out of Des Moines, the farm report droning on in the background. He had a cup of black coffee steaming beside him, and the smell of grinding metal and hot coffee filled the small space. His son, Matthew, was supposed to be helping, but he was more interested in a pretty girl in town and had made his excuses an hour ago. Jed didn't mind. He liked the quiet solitude of his shop. The farm report ended and the national news came on. The announcer's voice was grave. He was talking about the Federal Reserve, about a man named Paul Volcker. He used phrases Jed didn't fully understand, like monetary policy and restricting the money supply. But then he said something that made Jed put down his grinder and listen with his full attention. "In its most aggressive move yet to combat runaway inflation," the announcer said, "the Federal Reserve today raised the prime interest rate another full percentage point. Analysts predict that interest rates for operating loans and mortgages, already at historic highs, could soon exceed 20%. 20%. The number hung in the cold air of the workshop. Jed slowly picked up a red rag and wiped the grease from his hands. He walked to the door of the shed and looked out across the dark, sleeping fields. A cold wind was blowing out of the northwest, rattling the bare branches of the oak tree. Far in the distance, on the other side of the valley, he could see the bright yard light of Warren Bishop's new farmstead, a defiant pinprick of light in the vast, encroaching darkness. Jed felt a cold knot tighten in the pit of his stomach, a feeling he hadn't had since he was a young man shipping out to Korea. It was the feeling of standing on solid ground and suddenly sensing an earthquake, a deep tectonic shift that was about to bring everything crashing down. The price of money, he had told Frank. He never imagined it could cost this much. The long, easy summer was over. A brutal winter was coming. The winter of 1982 arrived not with a gentle blanket of snow, but with a frigid, biting wind that seemed to blow straight from the ledger books of the Federal Reserve. The 20% interest rate was no longer a forecast. It was a headline in the Des Moines Register, printed in stark black ink. In the coffee shop, the confident booming of the late 70s had been replaced by a low, anxious murmur. Men who had once talked of buying more land now spoke in hushed tones about restructuring their debt. The price of corn had fallen below $2 a bushel, a level that didn't even cover the cost of production for most of them. The game had changed. The music had stopped, and there weren't enough chairs for everyone. The first real crack in Warren Bishop's empire appeared in the spring. He was trying to get his corn in, pushing his massive 8640 articulated tractor day and night. The machine was a marvel of modern engineering, a rolling fortress of power and technology. It was also a financial black hole. The payments were $1,000 a week, a figure that was sustainable when corn was $3.50 a bushel, but was now a crushing weight. One afternoon, in the middle of his biggest field, the tractor simply died. There was no warning, no grinding of gears or puff of smoke. The powerful 16-liter diesel engine went silent, and the digital displays in the state-of-the-art sound guard cab went dark. Warren was a decent operator, but he was no mechanic. He checked the fuel. He checked the battery terminals. He opened the side panels and stared at the bewildering maze of wires, hydraulic lines, and computer modules. It was as alien to him as the inside of a television set. He called the dealership. Mr. Thompson sent out his top mechanic, a young man named Dave, who had been to special training schools in Moline. Dave spent 2 hours with a multimeter and a set of diagnostic tools before he found the problem. A small black box, the main electronic control unit, had failed. It was a non-serviceable part. It had to be replaced. "How much?" Warren asked, his voice tight. Dave avoided his eyes, looking down at the greasy invoice in his hand. "The part itself is $2,600, plus the service call and my labor. You're looking at just over $3,000. Warren's face went white. $3,000. That was the profit from 15 acres of beans, gone in a flash. $3,000 for a little black box? He stammered. "It's the brains of the whole operation," Dave said apologetically. "Nothing works without it. And it's a special order part. Have to get it from the regional warehouse. Might take a week." A week. A week of sitting idle while the perfect planting window closed. A week with $1,000 payment coming due. Warren looked out across the half-planted field, a vast expanse of worked black earth that was now his prison. For the first time, Jed saw real fear in the younger man's eyes. Meanwhile, a mile down the road, Jed and his son Matthew were also planting corn. They were using the old 40,020, pulling a 6-row John Deere 7000 planter Jed had bought at a farm sale for cash. The planter was simple, all mechanical, driven by chains and gears. The tractor was just as straightforward. That same week, a hydraulic line on the 40-ton-20 began to seep fluid where the rubber hose met the steel fitting. Jed saw the dark stain on the tractor's frame during his morning walk-around. He shut the engine off, walked back to his shop, and returned with 2 wrenches and a short length of new hydraulic hose from a roll he kept on a spool. He and Matthew spent 20 minutes unthreading the old line, cutting and fitting the new one, and tightening the connections. The total cost of the repair was about $4 in hose and a half pint of spilled high-guard fluid. By the time Warren Bishop was writing a check that made his hand tremble, Jed and Matthew were back in the field, the 40 Tironetti's familiar diesel hum, a steady, reassuring rhythm against the quiet uncertainty of the spring air. The whispers about Warren started to grow louder. He missed a payment on his fertilizer bill at the co-op. He was late on a loan payment at the Farmers and Merchants Bank for the first time in his life. The bravado was gone, replaced by a haunted, hunted look. He drove his pickup too fast, his face a grim mask behind the windshield. The empire was cracking, the foundations crumbling under the immense, invisible pressure of the numbers on a ledger. That summer was a scorcher. A high-pressure system settled over the Midwest and refused to move. The sky turned a pale, hazy white, and the sun beat down with a relentless, punishing intensity. The corn, which had been planted late in the wet soil after Warren's delay, began to suffer. The leaves curled inward during the day, a desperate attempt to conserve moisture, turning the fields a sickly shade of grey-green. The tassels emerged weak and shed their pollen before the silks were ready, guaranteeing a poor yield. For Jed, the drought was a hardship. For Warren, it was a death sentence. He had borrowed to the absolute limit, banking on another bumper crop and high prices to cover his massive operating notes. With yields cut in half and prices still in the tank, the math was no longer just difficult, it was impossible. The end came not with a bang, but with a registered letter. Jed saw the mailman leave it in the Bishop's mailbox one Tuesday afternoon. The next morning, a stark, professionally printed sign appeared at the end of Warren's new paved driveway. It read, "Public auction, Bishop Farms, complete liquidation." The date was set for a Saturday in early October. The day of the auction was cold and grey, the sky the colour of lead. A raw wind whipped across the farmyard, carrying the scent of dying leaves and despair. Half the county was there, it seemed. They came in their pickups and work coats, their faces grim. It wasn't a celebration. It was a wake. They were there to witness the public dismantling of a man's life, and they knew, with a cold dread in their own hearts, that it could just as easily be them. Warren and his family stood by the porch of their new house, a house they would have to leave in 30 days. His wife's face was pale and tear-streaked. His 2 young children huddled against her, confused and scared. Warren himself looked like a ghost. He was thin, his eyes sunk deep into his skull. He stared out at the crowd, at the rows of machinery he had bought with such pride, all of it now tagged with auction numbers. He looked like a king surveying the ruins of his kingdom. The auctioneer, a fast-talking man in a cowboy hat, started with the small items: wrenches, toolboxes, air compressors, the guts of a farm, sold off piece by piece. Jed stood at the back of the crowd with Matthew, his heart heavy. He didn't bid. He was just there to bear witness, to offer what little support his presence might provide. He saw Frank Miller, his neighbor, buy a log chain, his face etched with sorrow for his friend. He saw men who had once envied Warren now look away, unable to meet his gaze. Then came the big iron. The 7720 combine, not even 5 years old, sold for 60 cents on the dollar to a syndicate of buyers from Illinois. The big disc, the planters, the grain trucks, all went for bargain prices. The crowd was somber, the bidding sparse. Everyone knew the market was flooded with good used equipment from other farm bankruptcies. Finally, the auctioneer climbed onto the hood of a pickup truck. "All right, folks," he boomed, his voice echoing in the cold air. Now for the heart of the operation, the pride of the fleet, the John Deere 80 Auxerre 40 four-wheel drive. The massive tractor sat there, silent and imposing. It was the symbol of everything Warren had tried to be. The bidding started low. A man from a neighboring county opened at $50,000. Another raised it to $55,000. It stalled there. The auctioneer worked the crowd, his voice a frantic, pleading chant. $55,000, folks, for a machine that cost $180 new. It's a steal, a giveaway. Who'll give 60? 60, 60, 60. Silence. The only sound was the wind whistling around the corner of the barn. Warren closed his eyes. This was the final humiliation. The banker, a man in a suit who looked terribly out of place, stood beside the auctioneer, his arms crossed, his expression grim. This sale wasn't even going to cover the note on the tractor, let alone the rest of the farm's debt. Jed watched it all, his face impassive. His own operation was lean but stable. He had harvested a respectable, if not spectacular, crop. His bins were full of corn and beans that were completely his, unencumbered by liens or loans. He had already purchased his seed and fertilizer for the following year, paying cash from his account at the dealership. He had no debt. The high interest rates and low prices that were strangling his neighbors were, for him, merely inconveniences to be weathered. He had built his ark not of gopher wood, but of fiscal discipline, and now the floodwaters were rising all around him. He took no pleasure in it. He only felt a profound sadness for the good men being washed away. The auctioneer's gavel hung in the air, a suspended sentence. 55,000 once, 55,000 twice, sold for $55,000. The sound of the gavel striking the wood block was like a gunshot. Warren flinched, a single tear finally tracing a path through the grime on his cheek. After the machinery, there was a short break. People drank coffee from styrofoam cups and spoke in low voices. Then came the final act of the tragedy, the land. The auctioneer sold off the parcels Warren had acquired first, the Hemlock Place, the Southern 80. They went for a pittance, less than half what Warren had paid for them just a few years earlier. The buyers were strangers, men in clean boots with out-of-state license plates, representatives of insurance companies and corporate land holdings. The land was being alienated, passing from the hands of families who had worked it for generations into the columns of a distant spreadsheet. Finally, there was only one piece left. Lot number 402, the auctioneer announced, his voice softer now, more somber. The home quarter. 160 acres with house, barns, and improvements. The original Bishop family homestead, folks. Been in the family for 90 years. A hush fell over the crowd. This was more than just land. It was a legacy. It was the place where Warren had been born, where his father had taught him to drive a tractor. To lose this was to lose his roots, his history, his very identity. The bidding started. A local farmer, a good man, bid $1,000 an acre. The man representing the Chicago investment firm immediately countered at $1,100. The local farmer hesitated, looked at his wife, and shook his head. He was already stretched too thin. $1,100 an acre, the auctioneer called. A fine piece of ground, folks. Prime Iowa farmland. Who'll give me 12? The man from Chicago stood with his arms crossed, a small, confident smile on his face. He knew he had the deepest pockets. He was just waiting for the formality to be over. 1,100 once, the auctioneer chanted, his voice devoid of its usual energy. 1,100 twice. From the very back of the crowd, a quiet, steady voice cut through the cold air. 1,200. Every head turned. Standing by the bed of his old blue Ford, was Jedediah Stone. He hadn't moved all day. He stood with Matthew beside him, his hands in the pockets of his overalls, his expression calm. The man from Chicago looked annoyed. He raised his paddle. 1,300. 14, Jed said, his voice not rising in volume, but carrying an unmistakable weight of finality. The corporate man scowled. This wasn't supposed to happen. He was supposed to be picking up a bargain. He conferred with someone on his cell phone, a new and rare sight in those days. After a moment, he nodded. 1450. 1500, Jed said, without a moment's hesitation. His eyes were not on the auctioneer or the man from Chicago. They were on Warren Bishop, who was staring at him, his face a mask of disbelief and confusion. The man from Chicago threw his hands up in disgust and shook his head at the auctioneer. He was out. The land wasn't a bargain anymore. $1,500 an acre, the auctioneer said, a note of wonder in his voice. He looked at Jed. Going once, going twice, sold, to Jedediah Stone for $1,500 an acre. A wave of murmurs swept through the crowd. Jed Stone, the man they had all called a fool, had just bought the Bishop homestead. He hadn't haggled. He hadn't tried to steal it. He had paid a fair, honest price in a collapsed market. He had prevented it from falling into the hands of strangers. As the crowd began to disperse, Jed walked through the farmyard, his boots crunching on the gravel. He didn't go to the auctioneer's trailer to sign the papers. Not yet. He walked straight to where Warren was standing alone by the empty machine shed, a man adrift in the wreckage of his own life. Warren looked up as Jed approached. His face was a mixture of shame, anger, and utter bewilderment. "Why?" he asked, his voice cracking. "Why did you do that? To gloat? To finally prove you were right all along?" Jed stopped a few feet away. He looked at the younger man, at the raw pain in his eyes, and felt only compassion. "No, son," he said, his voice gentle. "That's not it at all." He reached into the bib of his overalls and pulled out a folded piece of paper and a pen. It wasn't a check. It was a simple, handwritten agreement he and his wife Sarah had drafted at their kitchen table the night before. "I'm going to need some help next spring, Warren," Jed said, holding out the paper. "My boy Matthew, he's strong, but he's still learning. I need an experienced man. I'll pay you a fair wage." Warren stared at him, speechless. "And this place," Jed continued, gesturing to the house and the land around them. "It needs its family. This paper says you can lease it all back from me. For $1 a year. You and your family stay right here. You farm it. You take every penny of the profit from it. And when the time comes, and you're back on your feet, you can buy it back from me for exactly what I paid for it today. Not a penny more." Warren took the paper, his hands shaking so badly he could barely hold it. He read the simple, clear words. It wasn't a handout, it was a lifeline. It was a chance to work, to rebuild, to reclaim his dignity and his home. He looked up at Jed, his eyes flooding with tears he could no longer hold back. The anger and shame washed away, replaced by a wave of gratitude so profound it left him breathless. I don't understand," Warren choked out. "After everything I said, how I treated you." Jed looked out at the rolling fields, the dark soil resting under the grey sky. "This isn't about you and me, Warren," he said quietly. "It's about this." He stamped his boot on the ground. "The land. It's about keeping families on the land. We farmers, we're all in this together, whether we know it or not. A storm like this one, it can drown any one of us. You don't stand on the shore and watch your neighbor go under. You throw him a rope." Life changed after that day. The farm crisis deepened, and more auction signs went up along the county roads. But the story of what Jed Stone did for Warren Bishop spread just as fast. The talk in the coffee shop was different now. The men who had once mocked Jed's frugality now spoke his name with a quiet reverence. They started talking less about horsepower and more about cash flow. They asked each other for help fixing their old equipment instead of just signing up for new debt. A quiet, seismic shift had occurred in the soul of the community. Warren Bishop became a different man. The arrogance was gone, burned away in the crucible of his failure. He worked for Jed that next year, and the year after. He learned from the older man, not just about farming, but about life. He learned the quiet satisfaction of repairing a machine with his own hands. He learned the difference between cost and value. He learned patience. He and Jed became friends, their bond forged in the shared work of planting and harvest, in the mutual respect between a man who had fallen and a man who had helped him stand up again. 5 years later, on a bright autumn afternoon, Warren walked up to Jed's farmhouse with a cashier's check in his hand. The farm economy had slowly, painfully begun to recover. Through hard work and careful management, he had saved enough. He bought his homestead back, just as the agreement had said. As the years passed, Jed grew older. His movements became slower, his hands more knotted with arthritis, but his eyes remained clear and sharp. His son, Matthew, took over more and more of the day-to-day operations of the farm. Matthew had seen the boom and the bust. He had watched his father navigate the storm with quiet wisdom, and the lesson had sunk deep into his bones. He farmed with his father's prudence, but with the benefit of new knowledge, using soil conservation techniques and smart crop rotation. One warm summer evening, Jed and a teenage grandson, Matthew's boy, were in the old machine shed. The boy was looking at the 40-20, which now sat in a place of honor, retired from daily work, but still kept in perfect running order. "Grandpa," the boy asked, "why didn't you ever buy a big new tractor, like the ones the neighbors have now? You had all that money." Jed picked up a clean red rag and slowly wiped a smudge of dust from the tractor's faded green hood. He thought back to that day in the dealership, to the smell of new paint and easy credit. He thought of Warren Bishop's pride, and then his fall, and then his quiet redemption. "Well," Jed said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble, "it was never about the money, or the tractor." He looked at his grandson, his gaze deep and steady. "It's about owning what you have, not being owned by it. It's about knowing the difference between what you want and what you need. A man's wealth isn't measured by the size of his barn, but by the freedom he has to walk out of it at the end of the day with his head held high, owing nothing to any man but his own conscience." He placed a hand on the boy's shoulder, the same hand that had turned 1,000 wrenches and guided a plough through 1,000 acres of dark, rich soil. "Never forget that," he said. "This land, these machines, they're just tools. The real work is building a life, a good, honest life. You do that, and you'll be the richest man in the county." He turned and looked out the open door of the shed. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the fields of corn and soybeans, fields that were paid for, fields that were his. Far across the valley, the yard light at the Bishop farm flickered on, a steady beacon in the gathering twilight, another family safe and whole upon the land. And in the quiet peace of that moment, Jedediah Stone knew a contentment deeper and more lasting than any number in a ledger.